Welcome to the Rising Latterly podcast.
Each episode, you will learn something fascinating so you can bring big ideas to your small talk.
Your growth is our growth. Listening to these episodes, subscribing to our weekly newsletter, engaging our posts on social media, and sharing our show with your friends and family is deeply appreciated as we work hard to expand this platform. You can also visit our page at buymeacoffee.com to contribute what you think the show is worth.
To the folks who are taking this step, we can't thank you enough. Look for the link in our show notes for more details about how you can support and follow us.
And now, please enjoy this episode. Jay Baloo!
Arjun, how's it going, bro?
I am feeling more and more like I'm simply surrendering to whatever is happening.
When did you start feeling like that?
Recently, I started reading a book called The Beginning of Infinity. It's taken me 11 days to get through the first 11 pages. It's one of those types of books. And in reading some of it, I'm realizing more and more that there could be confusion between thinking of oneself as a content creator and an idea creator versus being a receiver. So I'm simply thinking about all the episodes that we've done and realizing that I'm a vehicle for ideas instead of necessarily being like the creator of the idea. So I feel like the idea comes, you might create some emotion and motion around it to allow the idea to get to its next pit stop.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about that in the context of just everything that's gone on in the podcast and how much we've grown and learned and how many dots have been connected. And it's truly one of those things that makes you feel like you know your control of things is not as great as you think it is. And if I'm getting to the point where I'm more and more comfortable just being a receiver.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a certain humility in that. There's this line from Robert Breedlove, who's one of the big thinkers in the Bitcoin space. I consider him a very original thinker, but he was he made the very humble statement that there are no original ideas. You know, a lot of the philosophy that's become popular recently, the Stoic philosophy, or even in psychology, you look at all the Jungian traditions that have reemerged. A lot of those are like really old ideas that are just passing through new vehicles. And I think there's something honorable in just keeping those ideas alive. You know, humans have been acquiring and sharing wisdom for thousands of years, just passing that torch to the next generation. That alone is, I think, a worthy and honorable thing to do. You don't need the ego boost of saying that I created this idea from whole cloth. You know, it means something to pass it on.
Agreed. And hopefully in the conversations that we've been having and the learnings that we've had, you know, people are also receiving these ideas. And actually, I want to say thank you to everyone who's supported us so far. There are people in 71 countries that have listened to us, in over 1,000 cities on every continent other than Antarctica. I'm sure there's data, but Buzzsprout doesn't give that. But anyway, to all the folks, obviously here in the States, but in the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, New Zealand, France, India, Finland, the Netherlands, Chile, Barbados, Hong Kong. I mean, I can go on, but to everyone who's listening to us and receiving some of these ideas along with us, really want to say thank you. And also want to say thank you to every guest that took time out of their busy schedule to spend time with us, whether they were super well-known names that gave us more credibility or less popular names that had incredible stories to share. Again, it's been a unique experience, an incredible experience, and I look forward to the next 70 of these at least.
Yeah, absolutely, man. No, I second that. Much gratitude extended to our listeners and to the guests that have taken time to come on our show and share their ideas with our listeners. It's definitely been one of the more interesting years of my life. We're on episode 77, our first guest episode of 2021. Again, thank you to everyone and anyone who's been with us this whole time. Was Grace Gong, venture capital with Grace Gong. That, I don't know about you, but to me, that feels like that was a long time ago.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. And good for Grace. Her growth has been tremendous. Uh, you should check out her pod. It's called Smart Venture Pod. And she's had an excellent lineup of people talking about building businesses, raising money in the VC world. And she's really gone to the next level. So, again, in terms of like receiving ideas, receiving people, and
Yeah.
then, creating a situation where that idea or person can then just take the next pit stop. Grace Gong is a perfect example of that.
Absolutely, man. She's had a lot of incredibly impressive people on her podcast. Definitely one to watch. And on that note, talking about people and podcast guests, I think it'd be nice to carry on the tradition we started last year of just talking about some of the big ideas that we've shared in recent episodes. You and I went back through our lineup of episodes and guests, and I just wanted to share a couple of the ideas that really stuck with me and that led to, I think, what will be a lasting shift in perspective in my life.
Let's go for it.
All right. Well, the first one, I know you were a fan of this episode and a huge fan of the guest, Thomas More. He was the author of Soul Therapy, The Art and Craft of Caring Conversations. And one of the big ideas that really stuck with me from that book and from the episode was this idea that we all have the opportunity to provide therapy for others in our life, whether it's a family member, a friend, a coworker. We don't need the formal training in order to deliver therapy to someone. Like, we just need to be able to listen. And it's easy to say, I think, when you're faced with someone who's coming to you in a crisis or difficult situation, to say, maybe this is something you should talk to your therapist about. And maybe they should, but in the interim, you really can create that therapeutic space for them. It really is a choice. You can commit yourself to listening, to trying to be objective, to giving thoughtful and and intentional responses, empathizing with their situation, even if you've never been in it. And I think above all, to just try to maintain a certain regard for this person, even if it's someone you have personal history with, or rough history with. Just having regard for them as a human being, even if they've made bad choices or mistakes. I think if you can do that, people will open up in return. And I was thinking about this in the context of that Maya Angelou line: people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think if you can give someone therapy, if you can make them feel supported and listened to in that way, I believe that people will have a very positive remembrance of you.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. And that was a great episode. And I would also add to that, before the person, before the person gets to, the professional help, you're 100% right. That episode taught us how to create space. It taught us what it meant to be a good listener. It also helped me understand that regardless of the person, whether you know them or not, just go into the scenario with a beginner's mindset. Like, don't go in with your own bias. Listen. And then in that episode, he also offered up a specific way where it's like, you obviously want to empathize by placing yourself in that person's shoes, and you want to be able to experience someone else's pain. But there may be moments where you've never gone through that situation, but you can still be empathetic. And it's something as simple as like, hey, Jay, I haven't been in your shoes before, but can you tell me how you're feeling?
100%. Yeah. All of us humans have a certain shared, base level of emotions. We have the ability to imagine what life would be like in other people's shoes, even if the circumstances of their life are very different than ours. We can understand and intuit, and I think empathize with the emotions that they're feeling and the emotions that are guiding their life. So yeah, 100%, man. You don't need to have walked a mile in their shoes to be able to give therapy.
Yeah. Who
Well,
else
the
changed
other,
your perspective?
yeah, that definitely changed my perspective. The other one that really shifted my perspective was Dr. Grinker, who's
Hmm.
professor of anthropology at GW. He was the author of Nobody's Normal, a book on basically the history of psychiatry and how mental illness diagnoses have changed a lot over time. And that is really what I got out of the book. Like going into it, I had never really considered just how much psychiatric illnesses and the language we use to describe them have evolved over history. Like, I think of PTSD as a sort of objective condition that's as plain and as like permanent as something like cancer or diabetes, but really PTSD didn't even enter the lexicon until after World War II. So when you're, I think, presented with that kind of information, you realize that a lot of these things, these illnesses, aren't so much discovered as they're, as they emerge as a sort of different way of defining symptoms and behaviors that have been affecting humans for like time immemorial. So there were trauma survivors all throughout history, and they probably shared a lot of symptoms, but it wasn't until after World War II where the way we described those symptoms and packaged them together led to the label PTSD. And the reason why it really affected the way I think about mental illness is because I think, we live in a culture where we like labels. I think some of us, really cling to labels. And especially, in the sort of psychiatric space, people will label themselves saying, I have attention deficit disorder, or I have alcoholism, or I have an anxiety disorder. And, in reality, those are, as Grinker's research shows, those are constructions, like those are definitions. Those are approximations of what's going on with your mind. And there may be some accuracy in them, there may be value in them, but they're not fixed. They're not like unchanging. They're not as objective as cancer or diabetes. Whatever labels we have now will probably take on a very different name and a very different set of criterion 100 years from now. Like your, anxiety disorder will probably be redefined and further clarified by the next generation of psychiatrists. So I think along those lines, the takeaway for me was I think we have to be really wary of giving our full confidence over to the experts of our generation. And this is true regardless of what time you find yourself in human history, because, often I think when speaking about things that involve a lot of gray area, like the human mind or like public policy, those things are subject to change. And I think very often the game that is played by experts is that they speak as though the words and the labels that they're using are not subject to change, because if they admitted that they were, it would kind of undermine their credibility. Like, how can you really diagnose someone with attention deficit disorder with any authority if at the same time you have to admit that ADD likely will not be a medical diagnosis 50 years from now? It could become as obsolete as the diagnoses of shell shock or hysteria. So I think a lot of times like experts control the conversation through framing, which is grounded in the language, without really letting on that the frame they're using is subjective and likely subject to change. And I think we've seen that a lot over the last 2 years.
Yeah, that episode, again, we were talking about the full spectrum, and when I was in the context of mental illness, but for me, it opened my eyes to simply the full spectrum of humans.
Mm.
Allowed me to just understand that there's going to be a version of every possible type. And that's what makes being a human amazing. And if I can understand that and accept that, then I'm going to have much better conversations with whoever's in front of me. And then you realize that in the United States, almost 46% of adults are somehow going to experience a mental illness in their lifetime. So you know that this is going to be affecting a lot of people. You mentioned like word choice and framing. I can tell you this episode also taught me that people out there with autism do not want it to be labeled mental illness.
Mm.
Learn that the hard way on Twitter. So again, I mean, that was we're talking about framing and all
Yeah,
that
right,
stuff and
right,
word
yeah, right,
choice.
yeah.
But I mean, in terms of like this episode, it really just opened my eyes to the idea that a spectrum of humans exists. And that's just changed how I operate with everyone, because it also helps me understand, like, I'm part of that spectrum. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
weirdo. I'm okay with being a weirdo. And just I'm okay with who I am, is what I'm saying. Whether that's weird or not, that's just my own label on myself. But it just allowed me to just, again, understand that we're all in this together. This is a collective experience in many ways. And instead of labeling, it's more about accepting that that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's gray area in the human mind, and gray area comes with spectrums. It's not either you are something or you're not. We all are certain things to a degree, and for in some cases it becomes disordered. But even if it's not necessarily, if that attribute isn't necessarily causing great dysfunction in our lives as it might in someone else's, it doesn't mean we don't have a little bit of it. There's a lot of overlap between ourselves and other people. That's for sure.
And when you realize the full spectrum exists, it helps you learn to eliminate stigmas.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, stigmas are pretty destructive labels.
Yeah.
Well, the other kind of is an interesting segue to Ron Purser, who's actually on the show this week. We or I suppose last week, if you're listening, the week we released this episode. But he really challenged. That was an episode where I think my own thinking was really challenged. He wrote a book called Mindfulness. Basically, the general premise was that mindfulness has lost a lot of the ethical and moral foundation that it had in Eastern traditions, and really now it's been commodified. It's sort of used as a tool to pacify people, especially in like the corporate setting, to encourage people to just accept life as is. Don't do anything, just be. And I'll tell you, like, especially earlier this year, I was reading a lot of Douglas Harding. I was like meditating a lot. I was really losing myself in some of the books that we were reading, and just kind of like savoring my consciousness and savoring my mind and feeling one with things. And I had a very positive view of mindfulness until that bubble was burst a little bit by Ron Purser. And I think he certainly has a point. That it's not really just focusing on the being and not the doing is not really a sustainable philosophy if there are important obligations in your life that you have to attend to, if there are real problems in the world around you that require your attention. But going back to the idea of the spectrum, I think he is right, but I think there's a kind of counterpoint on the other side of that spectrum that we received from Bill Small, personal and business coach Bill Small. I think that idea that mindfulness is meant to teach us how to respond instead of react. So that awareness, that slowing down is good, as long as it manifests in a thoughtful response to the things that acquire our attention. So just, Bill Small, I think, was a really good counterpoint to Purser, because I think Purser's correct. I think mindfulness has been co-opted by people with less than noble intentions, but at the same time, at the individual level, I think if you can pair mindfulness with action, with that response, then I think it can be a very healthy thing to incorporate in your life.
100%. I love that. And first of all, I love Bill Small because he's like the Swiss Army knife of people. He's done so many things, and I loved having him on just for that reason alone. It shows that you can do many, many things in your life, try many things, like make this a memorable experience. And yeah, he did talk about blending the action with your thoughts. Otherwise, really, you're not going to get the full effect. And then in terms of Ron Purser and mindfulness, yeah, that was super eye opening and really puts a lot of things in perspective. I mean, literally, there was 3 words in that book that resonated with me that I think I'm going to take forever. Better adjusted cogs. Right? When he said that, I mean, it made a lot of sense because it's so true. Mindfulness allows you to take that breath and be present and be aware in the moment, which is great, as you were alluding to, because then it helps you maybe make a clearer decision.
Mm-hmm.
But it also distracts you from the issues or the movements that are taking place in the political scene and the social scene, and you're simply mindlessly operating in an environment that's really just the status quo.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you use the word mindlessly. It's like it's paradoxical, but it's true. Like the mindfulness can lead to mindlessness.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you
Yeah.
stop paying attention. Yeah.
And then the other element of it is it's deflecting attention away from the real causes of somebody's recurring pain and anxiety and stress. And you were alluding to that as well. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, both of those were great conversations. Great people as well.
Yeah.
There was an episode this year that I really enjoyed, and
What
the
was that?
book too. When Brains Dream,
Oh yeah.
exploring the science and mystery of sleep with Dr. Antonio Zadra.
I know that was a fun one, man.
Legendary. I mean, literally, dreams are something that become more and more weird the more I think about it. And I've said that many times on this podcast, but not only are dreams weird, but then when you realize what the brain is doing, it's also weird. It's like, to understand that the brain, when it's dreaming, is actually looking for weaker connections. It's actually trying to figure out which connections should be retained and like the ones you need to remember. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in another way, like sleeping and dreaming is helping us forget the things that we don't really need to know. And so, it's interesting to think that you could be dreaming to forget in some ways. I also found it super fascinating when he got into some of the science of dreaming, and he made the connection between what happens in rapid eye movement sleep, REM
Yep.
sleep, and what happens when you're on a hallucinogen like LSD. And the reason that in your REM sleep you can have dreams that don't make a lot of sense and all these different connections are being made is because your serotonin is turned off.
Mm.
And the only other time, or one of the only other times that happens, is when you're taking a psychedelic. And
Yeah.
so think to yourself that every single night we all go to sleep, or most of us go to sleep, most of us dream, and we all kind of like escape into this weird verse for
Mm.
like 8 hours a day. And then we wake up and operate in our normal daily lives. So yes, the book was fascinating and science was fascinating, but for me, the ultimate nail in the coffin for why this was one of my favorite episodes was because it allowed me to immediately relate to anyone the next morning. Like I
Mm.
can look at somebody on a Zoom screen or in person and understand that just a few hours ago, we were both in similar situations where our brains were, turning our serotonin off. It was trying to make connections, trying to like figure out the weirdness. And it's something we take for granted, but it's something that connects us all.
100%. Yeah. And to play off that word connect, I think one of the big takeaways for me was from Zadra was that we think that our dreams are just these like long disconnected storylines where random events happen, but really every event feeds the next. Like when you won't be able to remember your whole dream, so you'll look back and it'll just feel like a random collection of things that happened, but really there is like a through line, and what your brain is doing is like seeing one thing and creating a connection to another. You're kind of like, it's like little lily pads that allow you to move across the river. And I think I don't know, like after that episode, I realized that there's a lot of that in conversation. Like if you ever
Mm.
just sort of try to take a bird's eye view of a conversation you may be having, maybe at like the family dinner table or you're out with friends, like the way conversations proceed is one person will say one thing, you'll talk about it for a little bit, and then a new topic will emerge within that topic of conversation, and then you'll go and travel over there and explore that a little bit until it leads to the next thing. So there's a lot of like symmetry, I think, between dreaming and other social parts of life.
Yeah. And I like that visual of, you know, like a center of like a hub, and then the spokes where your brain is just trying to make different connections to maybe 50 different things, seeing if it needs to make those connections for your survival or not. And the other part of this whole conversation that was really interesting that I think people would find interesting was the nature of characters in our dreams.
Mm,
Like, how do our dream characters know what to say, when to say it? Their dress, their whole demeanor, the dream characters in your dreams. Just think about those for a second.
yeah,
Super, super fascinating.
yeah. Especially, yeah. It's kind of a conundrum if like there's a dream character that threatens you or that angers you. Really, that character is a creation of your own mind. So it's like
Mm,
being threatened or angered by your own mind. It's uh it it does kind of illuminate the fact that for any conscious being, in a way, the whole world sits like within you. Like when you close your eyes and that world disappears, you realize it's all there in your mind. All the emotions, all the characters, all the places. It's just, yeah, it's a fascinating thing. And as Zadra was very willing to point out, there's so much about it that we don't know. And that's
yeah,
why I really appreciate him as, a quote unquote expert in the space, which he is, because he is a scientist, very much engaged in like rigorous empirical research, but also at the same time very humble about the fact that there's so much that we don't know. I think like that's the kind of expert that we should revere in our society.
absolutely.
Well, another big episode for me that had a huge impact on my thinking was the episode we did with Dr. John Turk. He's
Mm,
a award-winning explorer, travel author. We were discussing his book Tracking Lions, Myth and Wilderness in Samburu. That was about his time with the Samburu tribe in Kenya. And much of his book and our conversation was just about the collective stories we tell ourselves, and how very often our collective imagination can be led astray by leaders with bad ideas if their messaging is compelling. If it's an urgent message, if they present us with a problem and they deem themselves the only person that can solve it, if they say someone else is to blame for the problems we're facing as a group or a society, if they create that other, if they create that enemy, they can get us to believe some pretty crazy things. Like they can take the collective imagination towards a pretty destructive end. And I think there's I'm sure we've talked about it ad nauseum on the show, but there's obviously so much of that right now. You turn on the TV, all you really see is narratives. And as he said, the good litmus test for whether a story is a good one or not is if it's designed to make you angry. There's so many stories out there that are designed to make us angry. And I think a lot of people are already thinking along these lines. They're pretty aware that the news cycle follows a narrative structure, and there are facts that either side omits in the interest of preserving their narrative. But just the way he put that together in the book, and created a parallel with the way that the collective imagination in Kenya has been corrupted by some people and leaders with bad ideas. I thought it was really interesting, and just brought it to life in a new way for me.
Yeah, that book was super powerful because he took us to the cradle of where humanity began and then started talking about all the anthropology. And really, he gave us some pretty meaningful insight into like the dark side of having a big brain and being able to tell stories. A couple things I found fascinating from that particular episode was how when they looked at fossil records, they found that art actually came before sophisticated tools. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then just his overall story of being out there and then finding himself basically in a war over an election,
Mm-hmm.
and he had to adapt to that scenario and be flexible and just be ready to deal with the chaos of that. So when I think about that in the context of, like living life, working a job, balancing everything, you just have to be flexible. You have to be ready for chaos. You have to be ready to operate no matter what's really going on around you. And so pulling from his experience, it helps me personally just be able to get through anything that might be chaotic in the moment. At least
Yeah.
I'm not finding myself as of right now in the middle of an African country that's going through a war over an election, and I may or may not be part of the right side of that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That actually kind of brings me to the last guest I had, Dr. Wanted to talk about Dr. Hollis, just his little 6 word mantra: shut up, suit up, show up. And that first one, shut up, he's like, remember, he's talking to himself. He's like, you don't have real problems. You know where your next meal is going to come from. You're not worried about facing violence in the streets. You're not worried about your children getting killed, by at the hands of a warlord, which is the reality for a lot of people in the world. That shut up, I think, is a really powerful piece of that mantra. And then suit up, which is like, if you want something, you got to put in the work. You got to do your homework. You got to get out of bed in the morning. Get over your fear, get over your lethargy, and actually do it. And then show up, which is kind of bringing it all together. Like, do the best you can in the face of those obstacles. It's not showing off, it's just showing up. And if you can do all three of those things every day, the compounding you get out of that is going to lead to success, and maybe even more importantly, it'll lead to living a meaningful life. And that I thought was really great advice, and maybe one of the like most concise but dense mantras I've ever heard. So I really like that one.
Yeah, maybe it's the reason that that became our most popular episode ever, audio and on YouTube.
Yep.
Um, Society, for some reason, gravitated towards that one. Maybe it is because it helped a lot of people understand how to avoid the quote unquote midlife crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And when I reflect on that episode, it helps me constantly think about my own inner authority, my own value system. And as you mentioned, um, suit up, show up, shut up.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty simple.
Absolutely.
But in terms of narratives and collective stories, a couple other topics that we might want to talk about would be with Dr. Krauss and Dr. Mireille Takashima Claremont,
Mm-hmm.
who they were kind of talking about behavioral sustainability and climate change. And those were actually episodes that went back to back weeks. And in terms of like collective stories, I don't know if you saw this, but we're recording this during the week of the 20th. And there was an article this week that scientists are finding that the change to the glaciers in the Himalayas is like 10 times as worse than they expected. So just
Damn.
trying to tie in collective stories and narratives, some meaningful guests that talked about these things, and then connecting it to some of the most latest news. Again, like the what's going on with science and climate change is alarming, and it leads back to understanding your behaviors and whether or not you're doing the things that are going to be sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, that's a tough one, man, because as a culture, I think we're not doing a great job of addressing that problem. And I don't know. I guess the thing I've been wrestling with is like, I don't know how much we can make a dent at an individual level. I don't know how we're all going to come together. What will be the great unifier that brings us all together and gets us on the same page and creates enough collective force and collective momentum that we can make a difference. It's tough.
Yeah, well, I thought it was going to be when we found out that the Colorado River was going to have a tough time supplying water to the millions of residents that depend on it. Um, and then in the context of Dr. Rick Taylor coming on, spending time with us. I mean, he's a professor of zoology. He studied rivers for basically his entire career. He wrote a book on it, on the history of the great rivers of North America. Um, so, yeah, I thought that that would be an interesting point because that one really hits home. People live by
Mm-hmm.
rivers, and then there's millions and millions of people that depend on this one river for water.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it does really beg the question. Like I don't think until things are truly like shutting down that the nation will be able to give its attention to it. It's tough. I can imagine how frustrating it is for someone like Kraus, and others in the space that are trying to kind of sound the alarm bells, and it's falling on deaf ears.
I guess what I'm learning from all this is that podcasting has been really one of the best activities that I've ever decided to take on because we've learned so much. We've had conversations with so many people. So going back to like the spectrum of humans, we've been in front of so many different types of people. We've had to navigate different types of interviews. We've had to learn how to ask decent enough questions for people to open up. So our interviewing skills continue to get better. And I feel like I've just become a more empathetic person through this experience. And so, you know, it's not a business. Podcasting isn't a business. It's such a fragmented market. There's millions and millions of podcasts. Like if you're going to go and focus on trying to make this a business, you miss out on the bigger picture. And that is the benefit to your personal life. All of the practice in terms of like the empathy, the kindness, as I mentioned, like having conversations with different people, like that translates outside when this record button is off, like it's helping me having with conversations at the dog park. It's helping me with conversations at work. Um, and so when I look at this whole podcasting experience, it's like, I'm doing this because it's helping me just become a better human. I'm not doing this because I'm in search for an extra dollar.
Mm,
And I think that like, yeah, there's been moments where you and I have iterated and tried to figure out how we can monetize this, but that's secondary. Like it's about just, having great conversations with people. And it's about, making sure that the idea that was received here gets paid forward or passed forward. So, I mean, I
yeah.
just love what we do. I love this podcasting experience. I love the growth. I love the people that are listening. And I look forward to many more.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think for anyone that's thinking about getting into it and maybe looking for the right motivation, playing off of that, it is really fun talking with people that you would have never been able to have a live conversation with without this kind of platform. I don't know exactly how many guests we've had on, but I imagine it's in like the ballpark of 50 or 55. All of them are doing like incredibly interesting things. We've had a very diverse lineup of people, and reading their book is one thing, or listening to them on a podcast is one thing, but I will say just sitting in this seat as the co-host and as the interviewer, it's it's like electric being able to share space with someone that's doing something fascinating and that maybe is from a sphere of people that you've never tapped into before in your life. The kind of people like John Turk, he's traveled all over the world. He has lived an exceptional life. And Jerry Haig, wildlife veterinarian. There's so many people like that. So many portals that we've hopped into by way of having this platform, and that alone is incredibly gratifying and incredibly expanding.
Yeah. I mean, even people like Wayne Simpson, who through a book of still pictures
Yeah.
came on, was an incredible guest, and we talked about humans. I mean, it's really just an incredible experience. And, I think one of the most fun episodes was with Buddha Bob Thurman
Yeah.
talking about wisdom is bliss. And then, I mean, like, just think about the fact that I feel like it was just in preparation for that episode where I realized that he's Uma Thurman's dad and all that stuff. I mean, it's like, what? The Dalai Lama's best friend and Uma Thurman's dad are just hanging out with me and Jay for an hour.
Yeah.
And to your point, this medium that we have right now of Zoom and this microphone and people joining, who knows how long we still have with this. In the future, things can be very different. Maybe there isn't this type of, conversation going on. And so just taking advantage of this opportunity to be in front of different people and have conversations and create connections. It's amazing.
Yeah, totally. Being able to produce your own questions, put your own thought into what you might like to hear the answer to, or you think listeners might like to hear the answer to. Like it's, I don't know. It's just really rewarding when you're able to consume their work, internalize it, look at it through your own lens, and then create a set of questions that maybe they've never received before, or that they have to think about themselves, or they have to like produce an original answer in order to address. Like that's kind of the thrill, I think, of interviewing. You never know exactly what's going to come out of their mouth, and the more work you put in on the front end to create original questions, the higher the likelihood that something original will come out of their mouth, even if they've been on many other podcasts before.
Exactly. So again, thank you for joining us, whether you're a guest or a listener. Jay Blue, I love you. Thank you for being on this journey with me.
Love you too, homie.
And I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season and is able to ring in the new year with just an unbelievable amount of joy and momentum and energy to make next year one of the best of all time.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.